the most vicious forms of anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic hate, with a focus today on the so-called independent review by Ms. Catherine Colonna, will come to order. Hillel Neuer, Executive Director of UN Watch, will testify today that the, quote, Colonna review was not independent. The verdict was determined in advance. He goes on to say UN Watch has demonstrated in detail why the Colonna review was not truly independent, including because of the manifest bias and conflicts of interest of the examiners, and because both the UN and UNRWA declared the outcome in advance in a mandate explicitly designated not to objectively examine potential wrongdoing, but rather to reassure the donors, close quote. The revelations of recent months about UNRWA's complicity in the anti-Semitic atrocities of October 7th and the involvement in supplying Hamas and protecting its terror tunnels has been a dramatic wake-up call for a lot of people to the reality that UNRWA is one of the chief drivers of conflict between Palestinians and Israelis. This is the fourth hearing on UNRWA and related UN agencies that I've chaired in the past 12 months alone. 21 years ago, in 2003, I offered an amendment that passed the House of Representatives to defund UNRWA. The Senate failed to take action. I and many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for decades have been raising their anti-Semitic hatred embedded in UNRWA. This year, my legislation, called the Stop Support for UNRWA Act of 2024, was passed by the Foreign Affairs Committee on February 6th by a vote of 30 to 19. It completely prohibits any U.S. contributions to UNRWA. My legislation, however, made it absolutely clear that, quote, nothing in this act may be construed to preclude the provision of humanitarian assistance to any agency or entity other than UNRWA, to individuals or entities that also receive assistance from UNRWA, if the Secretary of State certifies to Congress that such an agency or entity, quote, one, does not promote, espouse, or affiliate with entities or individuals that promote violence, terrorism, or anti-Semitism, as such term is defined by the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism. And two, does not employ individuals who promote, espouse, or affiliate with such entities or individuals. The House report accompanying H.R. 7122, the Stop Support for UNRWA Act of 2024, very clearly and unambiguously summarizes the case against UNRWA and the due diligence by the Foreign Affairs Committee, including hearings prior to the markup. In March, the bipartisan foreign aid bill that President Biden signed into law included language prohibiting U.S. taxpayer funds to UNRWA through March 25th of 2025. Before the prohibition took effect, however, the Biden administration was already contributing nearly 30% of UNRWA's budget, about $1 billion. There is a pause. We don't know exactly what that means. We've been asking questions to try to determine what monies have flowed post-October 7th. But this progress, especially with the foreign aid bill, would not have happened without the hard work by a lot of people, including Chairman Mario Diaz-Balart, the Chairman of the Foreign Ops Committee, and many of whom are in this room, most outstandingly by some of our witnesses. All three of you witnesses have made such an amazing, had an impact on what we do up here on Capitol Hill. You have worked tirelessly to research, document, and educate the world on UNRWA and its real relationship with terrorism, and as the major obstacle to peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. So thank you, Mr. Lindsay. You were really the pioneer here with the analysis and expose you wrote in 2009. And thank you, Hillel and Yonah, for your stellar work and the dedication in carefully documenting and informing us and the world about the anti-Semitic and destructive work of the UN and many of the NGO networks that the UN partners with. Thanks to your work, we have seen that shift. That vote that just occurred a few weeks ago would never have happened without the work that you've done. More and more people in Congress and the government are aware of the irreformable problems with UNRWA. It's by staying with this issue that Congress will effect change and eventually the effective elimination of UNRWA. When that happens, it will be a very good thing for all the peoples of the Middle East, whether Israeli, Palestinian, or any of the countries that maintain UNRWA institutions and missions. Our agenda for this hearing today is basically twofold. First, we have to examine the Colonna report, which was set up solely to whitewash UNRWA's record, and second, the U.S. funding to organizations other than UNRWA, which are affiliated to terrorists or otherwise promote violence against the Israelis. Regarding the Colonna report, it was in response to growing criticism of UNRWA, as well as the Israeli government's announcement that it had evidence that UNRWA employees had participated in the atrocities on October 7th, that the UN announced an independent, so-called, review of UNRWA. The mandate of the review, however, was restricted to UNRWA's neutrality procedures in order to avoid going into UNRWA's obligations to be independent and impartial, where it would have been impossible to hide its grotesque failures. Secretary General Guterres appointed Catherine Colonna, a former French foreign minister, to lead the review. Colonna has a long history of support for UNRWA and hostility towards Israel. Ms. Colonna tapped 3 organizations to conduct the review. All of them have similar histories, including of throwing defamatory accusations such as genocide and apartheid at the State of Israel. Senior officials connected to the report repeatedly stated that their goal was to, quote, reassure donors and to provide the donors with further cover. Yet the report is still interesting as another side of changed times. The authors felt it necessary to make some concessions and admissions. Most of the 50 recommendations are strictly small ball items to remedy management deficiencies, which already have been repeatedly brought to the public attention by our witnesses and other watchdog groups and ignored by UNRWA for decades. Yet the Colonna report concedes that UNRWA does not vet employees for connections or sympathies with Hamas or Islamic Jihad. The Colonna report concludes that UNRWA is irreplaceable and indispensable. As Mr. Lindsay says in his written testimony, it is simply not true that UNRWA is irreplaceable. In every UNRWA field of operation, the local authorities provide services to those of their residents who are not defined as Palestinian refugees by UNRWA. These local authorities, if UNRWA resources eventually were transferred to them, would simply expand their operations, close quote. UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency, was set up to provide, by way of background, in 1949, to provide aid to refugees. 74 years later, it has kept going by the UN General Assembly. There are few signs of the original refugees left. Almost all UNRWA so-called refugees today, in fact, belong to the vastly expanded number of children, grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren of the original refugees. And they are only refugees because nearby Arab nations seeking to perpetuate Israel's problems will not permit the Palestinians to integrate into their societies. UNRWA textbooks, curricula, summer camps, official media all exist to perpetuate the problem, inflaming them with hatred of Israel and the ideology of returning to their ancestral villages, where they will continue to wage war on Israel. UNRWA, make no mistake about it, is an incubator of hatred, and it is a child soldier factory. Aspects of its propaganda are so twisted, I won't describe them here, but its publicity available materials encourage children to martyrdom as suicide bombers, the worst form of child abuse. UN Watch has published many pages of documentation on over 100 UNRWA teachers and their Facebook pages inciting to anti-Semitism, and praise to jihadi terrorism makes grim reading. UN Watch has also revealed that how, quote, as soon as news of the horrific slaughter broke, which was the live streamed on social media by some of the terrorists, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency staff immediately celebrated and justified it on Facebook, close quote. UNRWA bears a heavy moral responsibility for the perversity we saw performed by Hamas in its October 7th invasion of Israel. I think the best thing for Palestinians and Israelis would be for the U.S. to pursue a two-track strategy. First, continue down the path of prohibiting U.S. funding to UNRWA, and that is the path that the Trump administration took in 2018, and that my legislation reestablished after the Biden administration restored it in 2021. And then the full House, Democrat, Republican alike, passed the legislation that continued that and made it law. Second, the U.S. should develop alternative ways to deliver aid to Palestinians. International aid organizations that are rigorously vetted by our government to be kept clean of associations with anti-Semitic or terrorist associations. This brings us to the second agenda item, U.S. funding to organizations other than UNRWA. that are affiliated to terrorists or otherwise promote violence against Israelis. Congress is not voting to prohibit funding to UNRWA in order to have aid to the Palestinians channeled through other terrorist complicit organizations. Yet that seems to be happening. I don't know why the Biden administration is permitting this, yet it has been unresponsive to concerns I raised about this last September. At that time, it became clear that the State Department awarded a grant to an organization whose webpage showed ample evidence of working with and celebrating senior leaders of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, both of whom the United States government has designated as foreign terrorist organizations. We will learn today about other examples during the course of the hearing. One thing is clear: under absolutely no circumstances should the State Department be subsidizing an organization that promotes the killing of innocent Jews and terror attacks on Israel. I'd like to now yield to our very distinguished witnesses and thank them for making the trip to be here. In some cases, a very long trip. Hello, thank you for traveling from Switzerland. And let me introduce our three distinguished witnesses. Beginning first with Hillel Nur, an international lawyer, diplomat, writer, and activist. He is the executive director of UN Watch, a human rights NGO in Geneva, Switzerland. In 2018, McGill University awarded Mr. Nur with an honorary doctorate of laws for his work to advance human rights and for being the voice for those without one. The university recognized Nur as an innovator in creating global platforms for courageous dissidents and champions of human rights from around the world, and for being a passionate advocate for human rights, fighting tirelessly against discrimination, torture, and injustice. The Tribune of Geneva has described Mr. Nur as a human rights activist who is feared and dreaded by the world's dictatorships. The Journal de Montreal wrote that Nur makes the UN tremble. Israel's Ma'ariv, a newspaper, named him to its list of the top 100 most influential Jewish people in the entire world. Hillel Nur is an acclaimed speaker who has testified often before the United Nations, the United States Senate, and the U.S. House. Then we'll hear from Mr. Yonah Schiff-Miller, Director of Research at NGO Monitor, a Jerusalem-based research institute. In his research, he is focused on issues related to the provision of humanitarian assistance, including the diversion of aid by terrorist organizations in Gaza and the West Bank. He authored and edited chapters of the 2015 publication Filling in the Blanks, analyzing misuse and diversion of aid in Gaza, as well as developments related to the 2014 conflict there. Yonah also researched and has written on the nexus between terror-linked NGOs, and UN agencies, as well as the relationships between these organizations and donor governments. He has testified before the Israeli parliamentary committees addressing aid diversion, anti-Semitism on U.S. campuses, and other developments related to NGO-sponsored BDS initiatives. And I want to thank him for flying in from Jerusalem to be with us today. And then we will hear from Mr. James G. Lindsay, former General Counsel for UNRWA. I'll say that again, former General Counsel for UNRWA, and a former visiting fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He has served as a trial attorney and senior attorney advisor in the criminal division of the U.S. Department of Justice, and as the Force Counsel and the General Counsel of the Multinational Force and Observers. And without objection, all of your full resumes will be made a part of the record. Each of you very, very distinguished and learned, and we are grateful that you're here providing your inputs. Mr. Nur, the floor is yours.
Chairman Smith, thank you for inviting me to testify at this important hearing. It means a lot because there are others who seek to disinvite me. Indeed, here in Washington on Monday, I was invited and a confirmed speaker in a panel debate at the Stimson Center. One of the witnesses who was scheduled to appear here, Andrew Hyde from the Stimson Center, is one of the panelists at that debate. It's a debate about allegations of bias at UNRWA. And the panelists are William Deere, the US representative of UNRWA, who's a professional lobbyist, and a former Jordanian official, and someone from the Stimson Center. I was a confirmed speaker as well. And suddenly I received an email several days ago informing me that I was disinvited. And it turns out I was told by Barbara Slavin of the Stimson Center that it was UNRWA's Washington representative, Mr. William Deere, who said that he would not appear unless I was disinvited, and so she chose to do the dishonorable thing, and I was canceled. So it means a lot that I'm invited here. Indeed, I would say this is not the first time that UNRWA has refused to debate me. I was invited to a hearing at the European Parliament about a month ago. UNRWA was invited as well. They receive more than 100 million euro a year from the European Union. They declined to appear. So UNRWA is trying to cancel me, but the US Congress, and under your chairmanship, we are able to share the truth. So I appreciate that. Now, what I would have told the panelists at this debate here in Washington on Monday is the following. The Colonna report, which was released just a couple weeks ago, is, we're told, an independent audit that has given UNRWA a clean bill of health, exonerating the agency of all charges of its ties with terrorism. This headline was repeated around the world and was used by several countries to reinstate funding. There's one problem, though, Mr. Chairman. These claims are completely false. Let's examine each one. First, as you intimated, the notion that this was an independent audit is questionable at best. We know first how it began. This began by UNRWA itself. The Commissioner General of UNRWA, Mr. Philippe Lazzarini, decided in January, it's actually before the revelations of UNRWA employees engaging in terrorism, but in response to our revelations and some others about UNRWA incitement on social media, on the Telegram chat group of 3,000 UNRWA teachers that we exposed who celebrated the October 7th attacks. In response to all of these, Commissioner Lazzarini decided to initiate some kind of a review. And when doing so, he told the press that these claims about UNRWA's terror ties were, quote, disingenuous, politically motivated, and constituted a, quote, smear campaign. So the same head of UNRWA, who was setting up the inquiry at the same time, he characterized the allegations as a smear campaign. In doing so, he irreparably tainted the credibility of the inquiry. Now, he went on to select particular individuals. He selected Catherine Colonna, the former foreign minister of France. That's not accidental that he chose her, just because just weeks earlier, she had tweeted a message out to him, to the public, praising UNRWA and saying how their work is more necessary than ever. This is days after we exposed the terrorgram, 3,000 UNRWA teachers in a group that celebrated the October 7th attacks. Madame Colonna was praising UNRWA. So he chose someone who he knew very well was sympathetic to UNRWA, to say the least. She was also basically a board member of UNRWA because she sat on the advisory commission, as France sat on the advisory commission. France is the fourth largest donor. So the notion that she would make adverse findings against UNRWA is absurd. She would have been implicating herself had she done so in a very significant way. So they were chosen, she was chosen deliberately to give the predetermined result. And indeed, as you indicated, Mr. Chairman, the heads of the United Nations and of UNRWA told us exactly, they said it in their own words, what the report was all about. Indeed, the former spokesman for UNRWA, Chris Gunness, who now acts as a surrogate, he appeared on Al Jazeera, and he said the following. He said that the report by the former French foreign minister, quote, will provide the donors with further cover, if that's what they need, with their own internal constituencies to resume funding for UNRWA. So he said the quiet part out loud. And then the Secretary General's spokesman said the point of the report is to, quote, reassure the donors. And indeed, Colonna herself said that the point of her report was to allow donors to regain confidence where they have lost it or when they have doubt. So the whole point, it was fixed, Mr. Chairman. The Colonna Review Group from the beginning was fixed. I'll just mention briefly the other members. There were 3 Scandinavian institutes that were chosen. None was chosen by accident. Each of them is an ardent supporter of UNRWA. Groups that have accused Israel of genocide and apartheid. And, you know, there's one group called the Christian Michelson Institute. This is a group that has published a major report on UNRWA just 2 years ago, where they said that claims of UNRWA incitement are, quote, unfounded. So they picked groups that have a long record of attacking any reports of UNRWA incitement. And they chose another group called the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, which is a beautiful name named after someone who rescued Jews. But in fact, the head of this institute is the complete opposite of Raoul Wallenberg. His name is Per Lundberg, and he tweets out posts by the Electronic Intifada, which is an anti-Semitic group headed by Ali Abunimah. And he posted in 2014, must-see debate about UNRWA video. UNRWA's Chris Gunness demolishes anti-Palestinian activist on Fox. He has shared other tweets by Chris Gunness with UNRWA talking points attacking critics of UNRWA. So they deliberately picked individuals and groups that have a lengthy record of attacking any critics of UNRWA. So this was the least objective kind of group you could imagine. So in truth, this was not an independent audit. Those who created the review and the people who were selected indicate that it was fixed from the start. And in the large part, the review group provided the goods. The report says the following: UNRWA, quote, remains pivotal in providing life-saving humanitarian aid. UNRWA is irreplaceable and indispensable, a humanitarian lifeline. Mr. Chairman, we didn't need to have an independent review group of the French foreign minister and 3 Scandinavian institutes to produce those lines. Those words are the official UNRWA talking points. We have a video coming out soon where you will see dozens and dozens of ambassadors and other public officials, including sometimes from the US State Department, parroting these lines: life-saving, irreplaceable, lifeline, indispensable, over and over and over again. These are the UNRWA talking points. So to read the Guardian headline, Mehdi Hassan, who's an anti-Israel columnist on May 2nd in The Guardian, he used these words and this report to attack critics of UNRWA. He said, it shows the critics were all wrong, all spreading lies, all peddling Israeli propaganda. So this is how the report was used. It doesn't mean there aren't things in here that are useful. And I saw from Mr. Lindsay's testimony, there are certain things in here, despite the conclusions that they reached, which enabled Germany and Japan and others, indeed, that gave them the cover to resume funding. There are, of course, some things in the report that are useful. But, you know, this comes to the point that some of the myths about the report, the myth that we hear so often is no evidence was provided. Israel has never provided any evidence, we're told, about UNRWA complicity with terrorism. I'll quote from The Guardian on April 22nd, quote, Israel has yet to provide evidence of UNRWA staff terrorist links, says the Colonna report. This was shared by Ken Roth, the former head of Human Rights Watch, and many, many others. Now, the interesting thing here, no evidence was provided, is that Colonna herself, even though I'm critical of her, but Colonna herself refuted that claim. When she presented her report in New York on April 22nd, she said the following. She said, some of these media quotes do not respect the text of the report. We've written UNRWA has not received evidence by Israel, not that there is no evidence. It's very different. These are 2 separate missions. Allegations regarding individuals is in the scope of the OIOS. That's the oversight agency. It's under their mission, she said. It's not the scope of our mandate. And she said it's no surprise that Israel did not provide evidence to UNRWA because it doesn't owe this evidence. These are her words. It doesn't owe this evidence during the OIOS investigation to UNRWA, but only to the OIOS. So even though Colonna herself said that it's perfectly normal that Israel didn't give you the evidence to UNRWA, and they are giving it to OIOS, and Israel is cooperating, she said, with OIOS, which has returned to Israel a second time, and is investigating not only 12, but even more alleged UNRWA perpetrators. So the notion that Israel failed to provide evidence is false. Now, the other conclusion that they provided in the report that, and I'm quoting here, UNRWA has established a significant number of policies, mechanisms, and procedures to ensure compliance with a more developed approach to neutrality than any other similar UN or NGO entities, end quote. Really, Mr. Chairman, UNRWA is the best agency in the world, we're told, when it comes to compliance, when you and I know, and anyone who's seen the evidence know that the truth is the complete opposite. And when I read this, I thought, as others have, of Stalin's constitution. The truth is that Stalin's constitution, if you read the provisions, there are dozens of articles in the Soviet Union constitution that speak about direct election and freedom of conscience and all kinds of freedoms. But the reality was the complete opposite. He adopted this constitution in 1936, right before the Great Terror, the Great Purge. The reality was the complete opposite in the Soviet Union. And yet it was proclaimed when his constitution came out as the most democratic in the world. That was the Soviet propaganda line. So the fact that UNRWA may have all kinds of procedures and mechanisms may entirely be true. But you and I know, Mr. Chairman, that the reality is the complete opposite. The reality is that we just saw days ago UNRWA vehicles driving around in Gaza next to gunmen, terrorists, coming in and out of the UNRWA vehicles. We know that it wasn't that long ago, a couple of months ago, when Israel exposed a terror tunnel directly underneath UNRWA headquarters in Gaza, and the terror tunnel had computer servers. It was a Hamas spy center, computer servers with electric cables going directly from the terror tunnel, from the Hamas computers into UNRWA headquarters, getting their electricity directly from UNRWA. And when Mr. Lazzarini in February was asked about this, his response on Twitter was, quote, "We do not know what is under UNRWA's headquarters. We do not know what's under UNRWA headquarters." But Mr. Chairman, a week before, the Wall Street Journal reported that 10 years prior, in 2014, folks at UNRWA had noticed that the parking lot was sinking. The parking lot was sinking. No one said anything. They knew exactly what it was about, but everybody knew. Wall Street Journal. No one said anything, everyone was silent, but everyone knew. Of course they knew. The only major construction project in Gaza was hundreds and hundreds of miles of terror tunnels. Next to my house in Geneva, they were building a massive tunnel for a train. We knew about it for a few years. Everyone at UNRWA knew what was going on, but everyone was silent. So the UNRWA line that they had no idea is simply not credible. No evidence of UNRWA terrorism. We exposed in January the 3,000 UNRWA teachers who belonged to the terrorgram group that celebrated the October 7th attacks. We've exposed for 9 years, we've exposed UNRWA teachers and school principals who regularly praise Hitler, people like Elham Mansour, a teacher in Lebanon, who said, "By Allah, every Muslim must slaughter the Jews." She's an UNRWA teacher. Now, these aren't a few bad apples. UNRWA said it's a few bad apples. I'm just going to mention a few people. There's Su'ail al-Hindi. People think that the head of UNRWA is a nice Swiss guy named Philippe Lazzarini, and he's a great, very effective spokesperson telling lies about UNRWA. The truth is, I don't think he has any idea what's going on at UNRWA. He doesn't run things. The people who run things are people like Su'ail al-Hindi. He was the chief of the UNRWA staff union in Gaza for years, and in 2011, when UNRWA was embarrassed and suspended him, he mobilized Hamas. He's actually a member of Hamas. He was suspended because of his relations with Hamas. Hamas mobilized 8,000 UNRWA teachers. The entire staff of UNRWA went on strike in Gaza for months. They shut down 243 schools. 220,000 students were out of school to rally for months behind a Hamas Politburo member. Su'ail al-Hindi sits on the Hamas Politburo in Gaza with Yahya Sinwar, the master terrorist. And for years, he sat as the head of the UNRWA union. Eventually, because it became public, he had to resign. UNRWA didn't fire him, but they asked him to resign. So as far as I know, he's still collecting an UNRWA pension. And he's a leader of Hamas, celebrating the attacks, leading the Great March of Return. And there are several other examples in our reports, which can all be found at unwatch.org, repeatedly, when UNRWA teachers are exposed for their incitement. Thousands of UNRWA staff, whether it's in Gaza or in Lebanon, rally in their support. It's not a few bad apples. The rot goes all the way to the core. And the Kolinar report, sadly, misrepresents the situation in UNRWA. We know for 10 years that we've been sending them all of these reports. The response of UNRWA was to attack us. We've posted on the internet, on our website, unwatch.org, example after example of how we wrote to UNRWA, tried to engage, they refused to meet us, like the UNRWA representative here in Washington is trying to cancel me, and instead all they did was attack us. That's the truth, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Mr. North, thank you so very much for that very, very eloquent testimony and for your leadership. I would now like to recognize Mr. Schliffmeiler.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you for convening today's hearing and for the opportunity to testify. Appearing today in my personal capacity, I'm the Director of Research for NGO Monitor, founded by Professor Gerald Steinberg in 2002. NGO Monitor is a globally recognized research institute promoting democratic values and good governance. By publishing independent analyses of NGOs, their funders, and other stakeholders, including UN agencies, we work to ensure that decision makers and civil society operate in accordance with the principles of accountability, transparency, and universal human rights. As has already been discussed extensively, failure at UNRWA is not new. For years, those who were willing to listen, including yourself, Mr. Chairman, were increasingly alarmed at the agency's hate-filled curriculum and periodic discoveries of weapons caches in its schools and members of US designated terrorist organizations on its payroll. However, the scope of these and other disturbing phenomena that has surfaced since the Hamas-orchestrated October 7th massacre is overwhelming. As you and Mr. Noor discussed, in response to mounting evidence of abuse at UNRWA, in February, the UN Secretary General impaneled a number of European NGOs, led by the former French Foreign Minister Catherine Colonna, to investigate. Though deeply flawed, suffering from numerous biases and unreasonably sympathetic to the agency, the report, perhaps unwittingly, does hint at other structural flaws at UNRWA. Described in greater detail in my written testimony, these include, for example, the presence of a coercive environment undermining accountability and oversight mechanisms in Gaza. My written testimony also demonstrated that many of the worst behaviors displayed by UNRWA and its staff in Gaza are manifest in other humanitarian actors, including UN agencies as well as international and Palestinian NGOs. Among these shared problems are aid diversion, glorification of violence, and other ills. Mr. Chairman, the Stop Support for UNRWA Act of 2024 that you co-authored recognizes this fact, requiring certain assurances before taxpayer funds can be awarded to organizations that seek to fill in for UNRWA. As you noted in your opening statement, the Secretary of State must certify that such partners, quote, do not promote, espouse, or affiliate with entities or individuals that promote violence, terrorism, or anti-Semitism, end quote, and do not, quote, employ individuals who promote, espouse, or affiliate with such entities or individuals. Mr. Chairman, the significance of this clause cannot be overstated. It is a clear recognition of the fact that there exists a crisis of which UNRWA is but one horrifying example. A broad fundamental approach is required to prevent a repeat of the UNRWA debacle with other agencies and organizations. Rigorous vetting is required to ensure that US assistance aligns with American policy goals and values, and to guarantee that taxpayer funds are not provided to terror-linked actors or to those that glorify violence and espouse anti-Semitism. In my written testimony, I presented instances in which US vetting of Palestinian partners was insufficient, allowing taxpayer funds to flow to terror-linked organizations and to those that glorified violence. This included funding a Gaza-based organization in 2023 that openly called for, quote, armed resistance and hosted senior officials of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, as well as to a West Bank group in 2022, whose head of the board attended a celebration of the anniversary of the founding of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, both of which are US-designated terrorist organizations that participated in the October 7th massacre. Moreover, a 2021 NGO Monitor report revealed several instances of US support for Palestinian NGOs that worked with children and teens, presenting convicted terrorists as role models, celebrating specific attacks on Israeli civilians, and other similar actions. With $180 million in pledged support for humanitarian activities since Hamas's invasion, it is crucial that US partner vetting be both well-conceived and expertly implemented. In my written testimony, I provided recommendations for vetting such assistance, including through UN agencies. Before discussing these proposals, however, let me state what should be obvious. The defeat of Hamas is a prerequisite for any day-after humanitarian strategy. This is essential not only to the safety and security of Israelis, not only for the prosperity of Palestinians, but to any hopes of fundamentally changing the context and environment in which humanitarian and development aid take place. Let me now broadly outline the recommendations included in my written testimony. Firstly, partner vetting must include an independent review of publicly available information regarding an entity's activities and statements and those of its key officials as they pertain to supporting US-designated terrorist organizations, glorifying violence, or promoting anti-Semitism. The US should assist in UN reform, ending the practice of UN agencies that fund, partner with, or solicit information provided by terror-linked NGOs and by organizations that support violence and anti-Semitism. Minimally, the U.S. should ensure that U.S.-funded agencies do not partner with such actors. Until sufficient and effective reform of UN mechanisms is implemented, U.S. contributions to the UN or to UN-coordinated NGO activity should include robust vetting standards to ensure that taxpayer funds are safeguarded from such organizations. Moreover, the U.S. should insist that relevant federal terror designations are applied to vetting partners on any UN project involving U.S. taxpayer funds. Lastly, U.S. funding should be awarded transparently, including the publication of the names of grantees and implementing partners, as well as the amount of funds awarded and descriptions of the projects that they are advancing. Simply put, Mr. Chairman, robust vetting must serve as the bedrock of U.S. funding to the West Bank and Gaza, especially as Congress considers its post-UNRWA engagement in the region. I thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so very much for your testimony and for your leadership. And again, from your reports past and present, we've been able to act on many of those, raise it with the administration. So again, I want to thank you for that. Mr. James Lindsay, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, good afternoon again, and thank you for your invitation to testify about the Kelowna Independent Review's report on UNRWA. The Secretary General limited the review's mandate to UNRWA's neutrality, so the report does not discuss, let alone make any recommendations concerning many long-standing criticisms of UNRWA, two of which are particularly important and which I will mention. There are additional ones in my written testimony and in documents I have written over really the last 15 years. My original document on UNRWA was written in 2009 for the Washington Institute on Near East Policy, and that document, 15 years old, is still completely relevant because nothing has really changed. What the report doesn't address that I want to mention today is that firstly, that UNRWA should be using the UN Refugee Convention definition of a refugee, which provides that a person cannot be both a citizen under the protection of his state of residence and also a refugee at the same time. Adopting that definition would reduce UNRWA's claimed 5.9 million Palestine refugees by nearly a third. There are about 1.8 million of these oxymoronic citizen refugees in Jordan alone. All of this would save a considerable amount of funding. Secondly, UNRWA should be vetting its Palestine refugee beneficiaries, at least some of whose criminal histories would bar them from being considered refugees under the UN Refugee Convention. United States funds should not go to any Palestine refugee identified as supporting terrorism. The report itself, even though its recommendations were limited to aspects of neutrality, and even though, as we've heard from previous speakers, that the review group itself was not 100% neutral, the report still came up with 50 recommendations, the majority of which, by my own count, approximately 37, reflect obvious deficiencies, obvious management deficiencies, things that, like the need for training, better coordination with other agencies, better enforcement of rules, employing more women as managers, things that any competent management team would have long ago addressed without prodding from an independent review. Some of those management deficiencies, and I'll mention two, the decision not to vet staff for terrorist connections when hiring or retaining them, and the decision not to remove anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, and violence glorification from education materials. These items these things I've mentioned are in areas fundamental to the operation of any UN agency, or they should be. Moreover, these same issues have been brought to the attention of UNRWA's management repeatedly and over a period of literally decades. I was not the first person to write about some of these things, and I wrote 15 years ago. Yet these same deficiencies have remained unfixed, unattended to, and still had to be noted in the Kelowna report. In short, the recommendations in the Kelowna report reflect both a lack of competent management and a decades-long willful obstruction of some fundamental reforms. They thus constitute a damning indictment of UNRWA's current and past leadership. There is a remark in the report, which has been mentioned here already, that was made in passing and that led to a media misconception regarding certain Israeli allegations. The report specifically noted that Israel made public claims that a significant number of UNRWA employees in Gaza are members of terrorist organizations, but Israel has yet to provide supporting evidence of this. That quoted statement has been widely interpreted by the media to mean that UNRWA does not employ significant numbers of terrorists and/or terrorist supporters. That interpretation is certainly wrong. The Israeli accusations regarding the 13,000 or so UNRWA staff members in Gaza were that about 1,200 of them were Hamas members and about 6,000 of them were related to Hamas members. Those accusations actually ring true, given two well-known facts. Firstly, Hamas has significant support amongst the people of Gaza. For instance, a March 2024 poll by a reputed and well-reputed Palestinian pollster indicated that about 40 to 60% of Gaza residents are supportive of Hamas. Secondly, taking that pool of workers, for this is where UNRWA draws its employees in Gaza, UNRWA makes no effort to exclude from its hiring process persons with Hamas connections or sympathies. Other things being equal, from those two known facts, one could reasonably assume that approximately 40 to 60% of UNRWA's 13,000 Gaza employees are in fact supporters or members of Hamas, which actually is not that different from what the Israelis alleged. After the horrors of October the 7th and the subsequent revelations concerning UNRWA staff participation in those horrors, the decades-long discussion about how can we finally force reforms on recalcitrant UNRWA has, in many cases, moved on to the question, do we really need such an incompetent and malfunctioning agency? Speaking directly to that subject, as other speakers have mentioned, the Kelowna report mirrors the views of UNRWA and the UN Secretary General, stating in one case, UNRWA is irreplaceable and indispensable to Palestinians' human and economic development. Yet it is simply not true that UNRWA is irreplaceable. In every UNRWA field of operation, the local authorities provide services, including things like health and education, to those of their residents who are not defined as Palestine refugees by UNRWA. These local authorities, if UNRWA's resources and responsibility for Palestine refugees were transferred to them, could simply expand their operations. If an adjustment period were necessary, other UN international and NGO organizations could provide temporary assistance with what were formerly UNRWA's responsibilities. The bottom line, UNRWA is replaceable, and given the Kelowna report's revelations that UNRWA's leadership is both incompetent and willfully obstructionist of fundamental reforms, UNRWA should be replaced. There are only three ways to bring an end to UNRWA's operations. The General Assembly, which created UNRWA by a resolution, could officially end it the same way. As UNRWA is almost wholly financially dependent on donations from mostly Western governments, those donor governments could halt their funding. And thirdly, lastly, a host state, such as Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, or Israel, could refuse UNRWA access to territory under its control. As a practical matter, we know the General Assembly will not take action to end UNRWA's mandate. But a halt in donor funding, combined with a refusal to allow UNRWA access to one or more of its fields of operation, would, as a practical matter, end UNRWA's mandate in those fields of operation. The current situation, in conclusion, the U.S. is prevented by law, as you've mentioned, Mr. Chairman, from donating funds to UNRWA until next March, and has been transferring aid funds to other international organizations in Gaza. And Israel seems to be decreasing UNRWA's access to Gaza in favor of other aid providers, such as the World Food Program. Thus, whether by design or by accident, at the moment, the U.S. and Israeli governments seem to be working together to accomplish a desirable outcome, a Gaza freed of terrorist control and a Gaza provided aid via organizations that are less likely to be compromised by terrorist supporting employees. With that in mind, the U.S. halt to UNRWA funding should be extended beyond the present expiry date of 25 March 2025. With any U.S. aid to Gaza being delivered by other organizations.